What's up everyone, Lance Hedrick here. In today's video, we are talking about decaffeinated coffee. Now this is a long time coming. I've been wanting to talk about decaf and especially how you can brew it, how you can optimize your brewing at home. And considering I've been drinking a lot more decaf lately, some really banger decafs, figured it was time to do that. Also recently, my friend James Hoffman posted a video, I'll link right there, on decaf, and he's about to start a decaf project where he's going to different facilities, different plants in order to look at different decaffeination processes. So I figured now's a good time to kind of follow up on his video, do my own video, do kind of my angle on what I like to talk about, the way I like to talk about things, and we're gonna do a little deep dive onto the science of it, the health of it, and how to brew it near the end. Now what really kind of started my desire, the dopamine hit for me to do this video, was not just the amount of requests to show how to brew it, but was the fact that California recently has been attempting to ban the use of dimethyl chloride in decaf coffees. What are the implications for me? So let's first go back and kind of understand how decaf started. In the early 1900s, around 1903, 1904, a German man discovered how to make decaf by taking acids and bases and using those to steam green coffee. And then in order to leach out the caffeine, he used benzene. Brilliant idea. Something we definitely want in our bodies in those doses. Well, because they figured out that wasn't very healthy for you, they then decided a few years later, in like the 1920s or so, to, instead of benzene, use, of course, chloroform. Yeah, the stuff that you can knock people out with. They used that. And instead of knocking people out, they knocked out the caffeine. All good to go, right? No. So then they went to trichloroethylene. Wrongo. And then in the mid 20th century, we kind of stumbled upon dimethyl chloride. Now this is available in massive quantities because the demand is high, it's used in a lot of different industries, so it's cheap, it's effective, it's easy, and it sucks out that caffeine without any issue. And we've been using that since the 50s essentially in most coffees. That has been the MO of majority of the world's decaf since about the 50s. You take green coffee, you steam it, you toss in some of that dimethyl chloride, and bada bing bada boom, you get that caffeine out, repeat as necessary, get as much as you want out really, and you got some decaf, all right? You got that caffeine extracted, you're good to go. Until California decided to invoke Proposition 65, which does rightly show that dimethyl chloride is a dangerous thing to have ingested in massive quantities. To help you understand this, the amount of that chemical that is allowed in coffees and roasted coffees per the FDA is 10 parts per million. So what that means essentially is a coffee roaster in 1 kilogram of coffee is allowed to have 10 milligrams of this substance. And the EPA says that a person, a normal human being, can take up to 0.6 milligrams per kilogram they weigh per day. So you are way in the clear. If you're anywhere near that FDA standard, which of course, are they really enforcing this with all the specialty roasters, et cetera, but I digress. Even still, you can have a pretty absurd amount of decaf a day that was created with dimethyl chloride and be absolutely fine according to the health experts in the US. Now, I can't speak for the rest of the world as far as the limits on it, but in general, decaf has next to none in it, and it's not really gonna do anything to you. Well, of course, if California ends up banning the use of it in coffee, then you can have violations as early as 2027 if you go against that ban, which will make prices of decaf skyrocket in California, making it inaccessible to a lot of people who may need it. Now we know that there's a ton of health benefits to coffee, so a lot of people should be able to have access to it. It has a really high level of antioxidants, chlorogenic acids, and what's interesting is in the past few years there's been a lot of effort in the scholarship world to kind of see what the relationship is between coffee and health benefits. Some of the things that you've probably seen online or read in some news articles or read in some research papers is the fact that coffee can actually help with Parkinson's, with cancer, with liver disease, and with diabetes type 2 mellitus. But it also has the capability of fighting off some viruses. There was one interesting paper that was looking at the chlorogenic acid levels in coffee and seeing its neuraminidase inhibitory activity and how it can combat some of these viruses. So there's a plethora of health reasons why you should take your coffee, just like you take a supplement or a multivitamin. Now, talking about those chlorogenic acids one more time before moving on, it's interesting because I have found in all the research papers I read over these past few weeks, up above a dozen. There was no real consensus on if there was more chlorogenic acid in decaffeinated coffee or in regular coffee. There have been some people say there's more chlorogenic acid in the decaf, which means that there's arguably more antioxidants and more benefits to that, and some who say it's more regular. I will say the majority of the papers I read say it's more so in regular, but I think it does boil down to what process you're using and how dark you're roasting it. Those have direct correlations with those levels inside the coffee itself. Now, chlorogenic acid is a very interesting thing because the presence of it can relate to the bitterness of the coffee. More chlorogenic acids means more lactones produced during the roasting, which lactones are bitter. Chlorogenic acids themselves are not bitter, but they do produce the lactones, which chlorogenic acid lactones are bitter. So it is interesting to look at chlorogenic acid and their levels, but like I said, making a decisive decision on whether or not there's more in decaf or regular, whether it's green or roasted, is difficult. People are definitely split across the board because there are lots of different measurements, and I've seen some say it's 10% less in decaf. I've seen some people say it's 10% more in decaf. Who's right? I don't really know. Who really cares? Let's just move on. But of course, with all those good things come the bad, which is the caffeine. And caffeine can cause insomnia, it can cause an irritated stomach, it can elevate your respiratory rate and your heart rate. And a lot of people have low sensitivities to those that need decaffeinated coffee if they're going to get those benefits, which they should be able to. And if this goes to pass in California, it's going to become a lot more inaccessible for a lot more people. Now, speaking of that insomnia, it's something I've talked about having, and a lot of people are like, well, it's because the caffeine you drink. Well, that may be the case. But because I'm not going to stop drinking coffee anytime soon, I decided to look into other areas where I could benefit my own health, and that's where it comes to the sponsor of today's video, which is Trainwell. Hey, well, here's a fun fact about me. I actually used to work out quite a bit. Take a little gander at that beauty right there when I was in my Super Saiyan era. Well, it's been a while since I've actually worked out, and I figured I'm not sleeping very well, I'm having some issues, so let's get back on the pony. Well, I've done that with Trainwell. Through Trainwell, you get partnered up with a personal trainer one-on-one, and through the app, you can connect with them, chat with them, and guess what? It's fantastic. I've been having an incredible time over these past 6 weeks getting back into shape. Obviously, there are loads of benefits to working out. Not only can you protect yourself from against injury, but you can also improve your mental and physical wellness.
How are things going so far?
Going well. With this Trainwell app, I've been able to have constant contact with my trainer, and he makes all these workout plans for me. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. I don't even have to think about it. I just get on the app, click go, and I start working out. Everything's out right there for me. Thank you, Rod. This has been an absolute game changer in my everyday life. Not having to stress, having someone do the planning for me, and just getting to get in, get the work done, and continue living my life on an elevated plane. Now, since working out, my sleep quality has increased dramatically. I went from getting about 3 to 4 hours a night to getting almost 7 every single night with a high quality of sleep. That's pretty great. If you want to try doing something like this for 14 days for free, your own trainer, check out the link down below where it says go.trainwell.net/Lance Hedrick. Maybe you'll start doing things like this. So thank you, Trainwell, for sponsoring this video and getting me back in shape. So what are these different processes? We have Swiss water, which is literally taking green coffee, soaking it in water until all the goods extract out, and then they extract it through a carbon filter, which takes away the caffeine. And they kind of keep reusing that water over and over in order to decaffeinate the coffees. This is probably the most sustainable way of doing decaffeination, but it's not cheap in order to get that coffee done that way. It's got to be shipped to the specific plants in order to do it, and it's not the cheapest way. So when you buy a Swiss water coffee, they tend to be a bit more expensive, though the quality is quite nice. In fact, personally, I really enjoy Swiss water decaf African coffees. Some of the best decafs I've ever had have been Swiss water processed Ethiopia coffees. Absolutely chef's kiss. Now, when you look at ethyl acetate and other solvent-based decaffeination processes like dimethyl chloride, what they're doing is they're kind of steaming the coffee, and then they're hitting it with whatever solvent they're using in order to extract out the caffeine. With ethyl acetate, it's obviously using ethyl acetate. Now, the way that they get it, a lot of times you'll hear kind of the term sugarcane processing. That's because a very common way of getting ethyl acetate is by fermenting sugarcane. When they ferment the sugarcane, you get out ethanol, and another byproduct is acetic acid. Put those together, ethyl acetate. And then they're able to suck out that caffeine using that. So you have a similar thing going on. They put it in the water, they steam it, they pull it out, kind of like they did with benzene, but not with acids and bases. They use water and ethyl acetate. So a lot of people will say it's the natural process because it all is all kind of natural, but they definitely use chemicals in it technically. So it does have a chemical aspect to it. That being said, it's absolutely delicious. No issue at all health-wise, because even at the end of it, they steam it again. It's so far away from being at any threshold for it to even have a speck of issue when it comes to health that literally there's even as little issue as dimethyl chloride could potentially be. This is like 100 times even safer. You also have the supercritical CO2, which is doing a similar thing, but they're using CO2, which is in like a gaseous and liquid form, in order to take out that caffeine, and you're good to go. It makes the coffee actually quite dark. All of these processes make the green beans quite dark. They look pretty brown when you're done, but the CO2 process, even more so, makes coffee look very brown. And then of course we have the triglyceride process, which is one that was very unfamiliar to me before I did this research. This one literally is taking coffee oils as opposed to these other solvents in order to leach out the caffeine. All very interesting and all very scientifically driven, but what tastes the best? Honestly, in my experience, I have found that the ones I have enjoyed the most tend to have been Swiss water and ethyl acetate. When it comes to Central American coffees, I've found ethyl acetate to be just absolutely stellar. Some of my favorite coffees have been Colombia coffees that have used the sugarcane process. Whereas, like I said, with African coffees, Swiss water has been absolutely spot on for me. And so overall, those are the ones I've gravitated towards. I can't say I've ever had triglyceride, and I've only had a couple of the CO2, supercritical CO2. And then as far as dimethyl chloride, they tend to have all just been, they're just not good. They're honestly, they're not really used in the specialty coffee world. People are usually using these more alternative processes that are a bit more sustainable, a bit better to get, because making dimethyl chloride is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world, especially when you have alternatives like sugarcane process or especially Swiss water, which is the most sustainable. Now let's move into pragmatics. How you should brew decaf at home, this stuff that might kill you. No, it won't. There have been loads of issues I've noticed on Reddit, on Home Barista, at coffee shops, talking with other professionals. Everywhere you have these issues with decaffeinated coffee. You see people freaking out because they can't dial in their espresso, they can't go fine enough, it runs too quickly. But on the opposite side, you have people doing pour-overs and they say it clogs really easily. The beds are super muddy. So what's going on? Well, obviously there are massive structural changes going on in any of these decaffeinated processes. Some more than others, of course, but chemically the structure is absolutely changing, which is going to affect the grinding dynamics as well as the brewing dynamics. That's an incontrovertible fact. During the decaffeination process, regardless of the process you use, there are soluble compounds that are being pulled out, which will affect the flavor, but also that structure, as well as other things that are happening inside of the bean itself. Now, I want to point out a very interesting post made by Dr. Mark Al-Shemmeri. Now, he actually decided, I want to see objectively what's going on. Of course, he didn't have a big enough sample size of different coffees for it to be kind of the final say, but I think it's very interesting, his results. So first of all, what he took was a Colombian coffee that was a mix of Castillo and Catora, and he had the same lot decaffeinated and washed. With this, he did 5 different roasts of each. He was looking at the behavior with roasting and the behavior with grinding. Now, my long-standing hypothesis on grinding decaf coffee is that it produces more fines due to a more brittle structure, and that therefore it causes a lot of that stalling, a lot of that clogging, etc. What's interesting is he found that across all 5 samples of the decafs and the regulars, that there was a 4% increase in the share of fines for decaffeinated coffees, as well as a lower median particle average across set burr apertures. Now I have this link below so you can check out the data, but what that means is he took an EK43 at settings 2, 4, and 6. He ground coffee at decaf and the regular through each of those settings, and he used a particle size analyzer that was a laser, not an imaging unit. Imaging units historically are not good at seeing things below 30 microns, as well as a laser, which is fantastic at it. So he used a laser in order to check out those teeny tiny little bitty baby particles. And there seemed to be a 4% increase as well as a decrease in the actual median peak. So what's really interesting here is not only do you have a higher fraction of fines, but you have a lower median peak particle. This is interesting. I saw one specific post that were saying they typically grind on their niche 0 at 18 for typical coffees. When they switch to decaf from the same roaster, they have to go to 14. So if they went at 18, we would expect it to have a smaller median peak particle already. and we would expect more fines already. Yet he still has to go a lot finer, which means that decaf coffees need to be ground substantially finer, not just with a peak particle, but also with the share of fines in order for it to run in a typical time. What it makes me think is that because those grounds are obviously not causing back pressure well enough on their own, is that there must be a massive decrease in the prevalence of CO2 in decaf coffee. Now, of course, you can have freshly roasted coffee and it will have more CO2 than as it ages. But it seems that decaf coffee ages incredibly quickly. He looks at the macroporous structure of the green samples of decaf and of regular, and it seems that macroporously, they look about the same, but it doesn't take into account the micro or even the nanoporous structure of these beans. And on top of that, it doesn't show what it looks like post-roasting. Talking with Dr. Smrke, he was saying that it seems that the pores would open up as it's roasted. So a roasted decaf bean perhaps is losing CO2 at a much faster rate than the counterpart regular. In addition to this, what's interesting is in a paper by Dr. Smrke as well as Andre Ehrman, when they were looking at different capsules from different manufacturers, they found that across the board, decaf coffees were ground much more coarsely. And that's because if they ground at the same median particle peak as they did with regular, the capsule would stall. So we have all this conflicting information. When you grind it, it shifts finer. So at the same set aperture, you have finer grounds and more fines, which in your mind would give you more resistance. But when we're pulling espresso, we have to go even finer than the same as the regular. We have to go way finer. That's really weird. But then in pods, they realized that it clogs whenever you go too fine or if you match regular. So they go coarser. What's going on? I'll be honest with you, I don't really know. I have hypotheses, I have speculations, but in the end, it's anecdotal and it's based strictly off of what I think is happening. And so I'm gonna offer that. But of course, this is just based off of experience as well as what kind of seems like the right thing. What I've noticed, as I said earlier, is in pour-overs, you tend to have clogging. And a lot of people have noticed this. I'm not alone in this. When you do too many pours with decaf, or if you agitate it too much, if you stir it or whatever, it clogs, and it clogs hard. Sometimes if I'll do one extra pour, boom, it's stalled, and I just have to take off and waste the last bit of the coffee inside the dripper. But with espresso, it'll fly out in like 15 seconds sometimes at the same burr aperture as a similar coffee. It just flies. But if you notice, if you ever pull decaf and you let it run for 40 or 50 seconds, just let water keep going through, you'll see that flow restricts more and more and more and more. And I'm imagining that's because the fines clog more and more. It seems that there isn't enough back pressure inside of that to go against that 9-bar extraction. And so it goes through really quickly and you have to compensate by going incredibly powdery in order to hit it. Some of you may not be able to go fine enough to hit typical parameters with the decaf you use. So I'm thinking that perhaps there's just lower CO2 content if you're using a week or more off roast decaf coffee. It also degasses really quickly, which takes away that back pressure, which gives you less resistance, which is going to lessen the pressure and make the flow rate a lot higher through it. But there are a lot of fines in there, and the more quickly they can migrate through, like in a pod, which is not packed very intensely, not like a tamped puck, and so the fines can immediately clog the orifice that's leading out because it's not a full basket like an espresso. So I'm thinking that what's happening is you have a lot of fines migration like you do in the pour-overs, which causes clogged filters. I think that's what's going on when we're looking at the effects across these different brewing apparati. Maybe a bit confusing, but hopefully this is going to kind of help you when you're approaching these things. So what I recommend when you're actually brewing your coffee, when you're brewing decaf coffee, is to first off, I've noticed always lower temperature reigns supreme. Even on the lightest decaf you find, I never go above 90 degrees Celsius. I'm staying quite low on the temperature. Now, yes, more chlorogenic acids will come out with the higher temperature water and the longer contact time. But like I said, if you're drinking solely for chlorogenic acids, okay, whatever, go with boiling water and steam the mish out of it. But if you're going for taste, lower temperature is going to do a lot better. And it's my thinking that because we have already taken out a lot of the soluble compounds during the decaffeination process, there's just not that much to give. If you push the extraction too hard, you're going to get a lot more of the bitter side of the equation, probably a lot more stringency and things like that. And in this picture here, what you're going to see is this is the same coffee roasted at the same temperature, at the same inlet air at the same time. Look how much more dark that decaf looks. I mean, that's a lot darker. Granted, the color variation is much tighter than it is with the lighter roasted coffee, but even still, look how much darker that is. It caramelizes a lot more quickly. It's a lot darker in color. It's going to have a lot more bitterness that will be imbued because of that. So this is what's happening with these decaf coffees. They're going to have that inherent bitterness due to how they're being roasted, which is a necessity. You have to roast a little differently. And again, that's in some of the things I'll link below if you want to read more into it. But I recommend doing a lower temperature. In addition, I like doing lower ratios. And this again goes to the fact that there's a lot less goodies to extract. Now, let's say we have 20 grams of a regular coffee that has 20 grams worth of incredible goodies in it. Well, with decaf, it takes away a lot of that 20 gram goodies. So with decaf in 20 grams, we probably have 75% of the goodies. So we increase the dose in order to match the amount of goodies we get in that 20 grams. Of course, it's not going to be the same. Like I said, chemical structures, solubles gone. A lot of the aromas, precursors for aromas are gone. So you just can't have the same potential in decaffeinated coffee versus the caffeinated counterpart. But increasing the dose will help as well. Another big thing I recommend is smaller doses. I know that sounds contradictory, but what I mean is doing smaller recipes. So instead of doing 20 grams to 320 grams and say, I need more coffee, and make it a 25 gram dose to 320 grams, instead of doing that, start at like 10 to 160, which is the same ratio, but up dosing like 12 to 160 or 14 to 160. And the reason I say this is the deeper that bed is, the more coffee that's in that, the more fines potential there is. When you look at the filter, the difference from here to here is not much as far as the exiting. So it's going to clog a lot more easily the more coffee you put in there. And you want to have a seamless drawdown. The longer contact time, the more bitter and drying the coffee will inevitably get. So I like to use a little bit smaller doses, maybe 12, 14 grams, maybe 15 grams in a V60. I never really go over that though. And if you're experiencing difficulties brewing big batches of decaf, that's probably why. It doesn't want to drain through and it's going to be stalling out and it's just not going to have a good time. Another thing that I recommend is grinding just a little bit more coarsely. And again, that's because of the potential fines increase. So we want to be careful with how we're brewing it. We don't want to go way too coarse and have a lot of boulders and a lot of fines and have this weird multi-extraction thing that doesn't taste very good. But we want to grind maybe a little bit coarser than you would with regular coffee. And then the last thing I would say is fewer pours / less agitation. Maybe even try a single pour. I'm not a big fan of those, but honestly with decaf, it's just a different beast. You may not need to degas it nearly as much. The water should be able to access the beans a lot more quickly because there's a lot less CO2 comparatively. And again, that's anecdotal. It's based off of experience and looking at it. The bloom is a lot less. When you're brewing espresso, there's a lot less crema, a lot less back pressure, et cetera, et cetera. But because of that, maybe just do a single pour or do 2 pours and don't really swirl. Don't do much crazy stuff. Maybe you can do a spin in order to allow the slurry to spin as it goes down to force fines into the upper parts of the filter. But other than that, I wouldn't do too much aggressive agitation. But all these things kind of combined are really going to help you with your filter coffee. As regards espresso, this is going to be really difficult because you need to completely reframe espresso in your mind. You are not going to get tasty shots chasing traditional recipes. This is the same thing if you were to switch from Arabica to Robusta or something along those lines. You need to approach decaf differently. Decaffeinated coffee will not extract the same way as caffeinated. So why would you treat it the same way and chasing the same ratio and the same time? I would highly recommend doing shorter shots. And when I mean shorter, I mean a smaller ratio and faster times. They're going to be a lot tastier. You're not going to get the body, but really the only way to get a heavy body decaf shot is if you're drinking super dark roast that's really fresh or really just any really fresh decaf. Which leads me to my final bit of advice. When you find a decaf you like, buy it as fresh off roast as possible and freeze it almost immediately, and then grind off frozen. This is going to help you enjoy your decaf a lot longer. Decaf ages so quickly, and you'll begin to get that kind of meaty taste on the palate really quickly after. Even with the lightest of decaf roasts, within 2 weeks you have meat. You don't want that meaty flavor. I don't know what the meaty flavor is. It's really grosso and you don't want it. Maybe single dose them into like airtight containers or, vac seal them or something, but do something to get them in the freezer immediately and you're freezing them in time and then just use it as you're going on. And that's going to give you the best experience with decaf you can have. If you want more pointed recipes on decaf, I would recommend usually a 1:15 ratio. I would recommend usually a below 90 degrees Celsius. If you're on the really light end of the spectrum with roast, then maybe around 89, 88. If you're a darker roast lover and it's a darker decaf, maybe around 82, 83, 84. And focus on that 1:15 ratio. Focus on getting a quicker drawdown, and don't focus on agitation. Don't focus on those things. Get a little coarser grounds. Don't go crazy though, but get a little coarser than you would for your typical pour over that you like at home. For espresso, again, for more specific pointed recipes, for lighter coffees, do maybe a 1:2 ratio and go shoot for like that 18 to 20 second time. If you're doing a darker roasted coffee, if you can lower the temperature, do that, but also shoot for something like a 1:1 or a 1:1.5, and you will find a lot more pleasant experiences in your chase for a tasty decaf shot. And again, don't be bound by time. 15 seconds may be delicious. You may just be losing out on some of that texture. So I guess for the people who enjoy darker coffees, you have to ask yourself, do you want texture or do you want taste? If you want texture, it needs to be right off roast, and you need to get that 1:1.5 in like 25 seconds. That's great, just may not taste nearly as good as if you were to let it go through a little bit faster. But anyway, I think that hits all that I wanted to hit today on decaf. I hope it was a nice overview and maybe a little refresher of some of the things that you may have already known. Maybe you learned some new things. Again, like I always do with videos like this, I'll put a lot of the research papers that I use in constructing this video down below, as well as some helpful links. Now, if you enjoy the content, if you enjoy the amount of effort I put into these videos, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, hit the subscribe, turn on the notifications, all that good stuff. Check out my Patreon down below, my second YouTube, all that stuff. Regardless, I really appreciate you staying with me this whole time. Thanks for watching the video, and I hope that you brew something tasty today. Cheers.